So a little bit of housekeeping first. If you enjoy the videos, please give it a thumbs up. It really goes a long way. Obviously, quite a small channel, so really important for us with the algorithm. If you have a specific game in mind, whether it's Champions League, Women's Champions League, Women's Super League, whatever, put your suggestions in the comments down below and hopefully I'll be able to analyse them at some point. If you have any feedback, please leave it in the comments down below as well. With that, let's look at how Chelsea attacked Manchester City. So starting off, Chelsea played out the back with a 3-3-4 kind of shape. So amongst those four forwards, you actually had Kante as well as also Alonso. You would keep James relatively deep during the build-up, whereas Kante was a little bit higher, trying to avoid him being involved in a deeper build-up just because he's a little bit more pressable. I think this is a good place to just touch a little bit on Manchester City's press and how narrow they had their forwards. So this here being the right winger in Gabriel Jesus is actually tucked in a lot so that he can press Kovacic, who's dropped deeper in that 3-3-4 build-up for Chelsea. I do think Jesus' position varied. So at times he was almost playing as a second centre forward with Foden, so that it was like a 4-1-3-2 with Bernardo Silva kind of covering that right hand side, and he would be really quick to try and press towards Manchester City's right, Chelsea's left if Manchester City went that way, but there was more of an inclination towards pressing and being closer to Chelsea's players on Chelsea's right hand side, Manchester City's left, so saying where Cancelo is, where Reece James is. That's likely due to it being a little bit easier, I'd say, for Jorginho to be able to build up on that side because he's right footed, and obviously he's the one that you're trying to use to build up through the thirds. Chelsea definitely gave up on this. It was, I think, quite fruitless because of the intensity of Manchester City's press, but then also even when they did beat the press, the ball didn't stick. I'd say probably due to the relatively poor combination between Lukaku and Werner, initially staying relatively narrow, that not working, and then splitting, and then finding that they couldn't pass to each other in that scenario either. So to try and take advantage of Manchester City having a high line, typically due to them pressing and obviously wanting to have the defenders high up the pitch to try and help that press, but then also in that they have possession for most of the game, Chelsea tried to take advantage of that high line by having runners in behind. This is a little bit later on in the game, so at this point we have Havertz on 2 and he's trying to make runs in behind, as well as also with Lukaku and Werner. Just a quick note as well with regards to Kante's positioning as well as Alonso's positioning. So I mentioned that 3-3-4 earlier, and they were typically the ones higher. They were the ones that Lukaku and Werner were meant to try and use to support and to act as a platform so the rest of the team could then support. I do think that they were quite useful, especially Alonso. Although I'd say that Guardiola had a good foil against Alonso in Silva, who tried to position to cover for how aggressive Alonso was. So beyond trying to build up initially from deep and then going long as well, Chelsea tried to include counters into their attacking as well. Among the ways that Chelsea countered in this game, I'd say, was off Manchester City corners. So whenever they could, Mendy would immediately try and throw the ball out, typically looking towards Alonso, but he would kind of just try and get the ball out as quickly as possible whilst Manchester City's players were still quite high up in Chelsea's half. To that point, I do leave a summary of my tactic notes in the description down below, and I'll also post them in the comments, so please have a look. It's a little bit more comprehensive than the video. This is another type of Chelsea's counters. So we've mentioned countering from corners, we've mentioned countering / being very direct when they beat the press, but then this being a counter on regain. So in this scenario, Manchester City are trying to build up on the right hand side. They have a little bit of a combination here between Jesus and De Bruyne, but Rudiger's, I think he's the fastest player in Chelsea, so he's able to beat Jesus into that space and just prevent Jesus from getting there, and then Alonso is able to try and start a counter-attack. I think this is a good place to also highlight how important Jorginho was at defending that central space. There were numerous times where both Kovacic as well as also Kante were taking up more advanced positions. So we see that here with Kovacic specifically. Kante in this scenario is covered across, but I'll show some examples a little bit later where Chelsea are almost in like a 5-1-4 shape, where Kante and Kovacic are pushed higher up to try and kind of force Manchester City to play into their fullbacks and down into the wide space and try and prevent the likes of Bernardo Silva, De Bruyne, etc. floating in those pockets of space and try and progress through the thirds centrally. Given Chelsea's plan to counter-attack on any chance that they had, Manchester City were very happy to foul them regardless of the fact that they didn't have Fernandinho on the pitch. If it seemed like Manchester City's defenders were slightly mispositioned, Chelsea might have a slight advantage, they'll just foul you, just bring you down as early as possible. Chelsea also did this when Manchester City sought to spring counterattacks to. Okay, so Tuchel made a number of substitutions to try and swing the game back in Chelsea's favour. There was a little bit of a debate amongst the commentators about why didn't Tuchel do this a little bit earlier? Why did he have three centre midfielders and relatively defensive centre midfielders in Kovacic, Kante and Jorginho? When you look at the actual chances that Manchester City had and how solid that midfield three is compared to the other midfield options that Chelsea have, obviously they have Sané now as well, but it does seem a little bit weird that they asked that question. I do think they had a point in just how attacking Chelsea were able to be with Loftus-Cheek on the pitch as well as Havertz. So in this scenario, we can see Havertz very high up the pitch, furthest forwards, running in behind, trying to get onto the end of a long Antonio Rudiger through ball or direct ball. This ball is actually swept up by Edison. He does really well. At this point, you've got Kovacic being the CDM rather than Jorginho, and it's important to just mention that in terms of just how much the dynamic has changed. Whereas earlier, instead of maybe Havertz being where he is, you'd have had Kante. So Kante would be maybe here instead. He's still trying to be in a position where he can support Lukaku or Havertz if they receive the ball, but then he's still deep enough that if things break down, he can get back. Whereas obviously in this situation, Havertz is not thinking of going back at all. So I wouldn't draw too many distinctions actually between Ruben Loftus-Cheek in this position that he's in now and actually Kovacic's role when Kovacic was playing us that slightly deeper than Kante role that he's playing, but obviously a bit further forward than Jorginho, in that they both have this great ability to be able to just glide past people and break past the press. So I do think there's similarities there. Jumping slightly ahead, this also gives a good example of just how aggressive Manchester City's fullbacks were. This is Kyle Walker, who's meant to be the right back, and look how far away he is from his centre-back partner. There's no way that he can provide any cover. But this was something that the Manchester City fullbacks, both Cancelo and Walker, were expected to do throughout the game. They were expected to be on the front foot. And I say similarly with Chelsea as well. There was a lot of their wide centre-backs as well as also the wing-backs that had to be on the front foot, pressing the opponent. This is also a good example of what I was just mentioning with regards to the Manchester City's fullbacks and how aggressive they were. So that's Kyle Walker there tracking Alonso. So Alonso and Kai Havertz had this partnership where they would try to work together to try and create positions where they could maybe underlap or overlap each other and just try and pull apart the right-hand side of Manchester City's defence and wide midfielders, etc. Trying to exploit the fact that Manchester City's right midfielder in Gabriel Jesus was typically trying to help with the press and stay relatively narrow, try and press centre-backs or maybe the centre midfielder a little bit higher up the pitch. And this also goes back to the point that I mentioned earlier with regards to Bernardo Silva. So you see him here where he's a lot deeper. Technically, you might say they were playing a 4-3-3 or 4-2-3-1, but he was a lot deeper, typically, I'd say, than De Bruyne. Constantly being in, I think, more of a right centre defensive midfield position, trying to cover for the fact that Kyle Walker's having to rush out to try and press Alonso and try and stop Alonso in his tracks. And he knows that Chelsea are going to try and exploit that space, whether it's with the run of Lukaku or Werner or whoever into that space behind. And in this situation, it's Kai Havertz. So another way that Havertz was trying to help, as well as staying relatively wide and trying to dovetail with Alonso, was also dropping deep from that left forward position. We see that with him here. So he's dropped off the line and he's trying to make himself an option for Kovacic to be able to just play it as Bernardo Silva pushes out to try and help Manchester City's forwards press. So Manchester City have been able to funnel the ball out here towards the right-hand side, and we're able to see a strength of Ruben Loftus-Cheek and why he was brought on to try and receive the ball in this right-hand side space and kind of drive and force Chelsea up the pitch. I've got Bernardo Silva highlighted again just because he's doing that right-sided centre defensive midfielder slash almost a right wing-back position here. So we can see him here, and his positioning allows Kyle Walker to stay relatively narrow. This allows Kyle Walker to be able to try and cover the run of Werner, who's trying to run through the centre. Okay, so here we're having a look at Manchester City's build-up. So typically I think in a 2-3 shape, the fullbacks do get very wide and very high. It almost looked like a 2-4 at times. So you can see here with Bernardo Silva dropping a little bit deeper, that he would come a little bit deeper and offer himself as an option, potentially drag a centre midfielder for Chelsea a little bit higher up the pitch as well. So in this scenario we see that Werner and Lukaku don't want to commit to either side until the ball has been passed towards whichever side Manchester City choose. They're going to try and prevent any passes or any easy passes into Rodri. You also have Kovacic very high at the pitch. He's trying to engage as high as possible. You're having the same thing with Kante on the other side. So how I mentioned a little bit earlier during the video about the 5-1-4 shape, this is part of that. These two, in Kovacic and Kante, are going to try and look to press towards the fullback of Manchester City. So we have Jorginho here, and he's tracked Rodri, and you see just how advanced Jorginho is. Obviously, relatively slow centre-defensive midfielder. At this point, obviously, they have Kai Havertz on instead. Instead of that 5-3-2 shape with a relatively conservative, initial stance when Manchester City had the ball deep, this was later in the game where Chelsea instead went to a more aggressive 5-2-3. Yes, their centre midfielders in Kovacic and Jorginho would track the centre midfielders of Manchester City, but Chelsea at this point really wanted to try and just get something out of the game. So they were happy to go man to man at the back. Of course, Manchester City were happy to just play over them and take advantage of the fact that with Chelsea's centre midfielders in both Jorginho as well as also Kovacic being quite as high as they were, it meant that there was a lot of space for the likes of De Bruyne as well as Foden to be able to operate. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, Bernardo Silva was constantly dropping deeper. In that scenario, we were talking about it with regards to helping defensively. In this scenario, we're looking at him here, dropping a little bit deeper to help build up. Again, we've got that shape that we talked about earlier for Chelsea, so we've got a kind of a 5-1-4 here, but in this scenario we've got Jorginho probably a little bit higher than one would expect. Typically we'd expect him maybe to be here instead, but we've got, as mentioned earlier, the relatively wide positions of both Kante as well as Kovacic, looking to try and press in the wide spaces if Manchester City try and go out there, but also clogging up those half spaces. In case we don't get to it, Werner was really important at dropping a little bit deeper and just trying to help the Chelsea midfield to be able to kind of cover the spaces ahead of them. Okay, this is a really good example of what we mentioned earlier. It's kind of the opposite of the example that we looked at where we had Kante covering over. So in this scenario we have Kovacic covering and he's closer to Jorginho, whereas with Kante, we've got Kante a lot higher. He's almost in a right wing position, right forward position, trying to press towards the Manchester City fullback. Manchester City here are in the shape that they favoured for much of the game, so a 3-1 where Kyle Walker is playing as that third centre-back, and you've got Rodri as a centre-defensive midfielder, whilst you've got Cancelo really high up on that left-hand side. Manchester City were constantly looking to try and test the space out here, so you're going to have movement by Cancelo, as well as Foden dropping off, and De Bruyne and Grealish all moving in that space, trying to kind of pull apart the centre midfielder, wide centre-back and wing-back of Chelsea on that side. So this being the next part of that phase of play, so you can see here where Azpilicueta, as in the previous picture, was positioning to try and stop this as soon as he could. We've got Foden dropping off the line, and despite being the centre forward, we've got Azpilicueta tracking him, and then you've got Grealish running from outside to in to try and draw Reece James away from the touchline and give a little bit more space out here for Cancelo. Again, look how big the space is that's been left in behind. And this is another example from earlier in the game. The same sort of thing is being built up on that left-hand side for Manchester City again. You've got Lukaku tracking across to try and prevent the easy pass into Rodri. You've got the very high position of Kante trying to prevent easy possession down the wide spaces for the fullback of Manchester City. You're seeing Reece James being pulled out quite high to try and press whoever is in that wide space in the wide midfield position for Manchester City. In this scenario, we've got that being De Bruyne rather than Grealish, who's actually a little bit higher up. And you can see as the play develops, again, the same sort of pattern is developing. You've got Grealish running from outside to in, you've got De Bruyne running from outside to in, all creating space out here again. And this is the last example. Whilst Manchester City did predominantly attack, I think, with success on the left-hand side, they did make sure to mix it up, and they used the fact that Gabriel Jesus was typically holding the width on the right-hand side to just keep Chelsea honest, keep the defence as wide as possible. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and also leave a comment down below. What do you think of Chelsea's tactics? Do you think they should have been more attacking as commentators thought, or do you think it was a case of trying to strike a balance? And with that,